Helping refugees in Hungary just became a crime after the country passes anti-immigration laws. Is the new legislation xenophobic? I'm Imran Garza, and today's newsmaker is Hungary's Stop Soros bill. In most countries, lending a helping hand is seen as a good thing. But in Hungary, it could land you behind bars. This week, the government passed a series of laws making it illegal to help undocumented migrants. They're calling it the Stop Soros laws, named after the Hungarian-born billionaire, best known for his funding of liberal causes. Hungary's right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orban is not a fan. He accuses Soros of undermining the country's Christian culture by encouraging mass migration. In a moment, I'll ask the Hungarian government why they have such a problem with Soros. But first, Christine Pirovolakis has this report.
If anybody in Hungary acts in a way that damages our security interests, then they must anticipate consequences.
Hungary has passed legislation punishing anyone who helps people seek asylum in the country. Now, anyone found guilty of helping asylum seekers will face a year in jail.
We are talking about medical care, psychosocial care, housing, employment, education. We are talking about legal aid. So these people who are forced to flee war, forced to flee violence, these people would be left without these assistances.
It's part of a package of bills called Stop Soros, named after U.S. billionaire investor George Soros. He funds the Open Society foundations, and Hungary accuses him of supporting Muslim immigrants and meddling in the country's domestic affairs.
I stand up for the principles I believe in, and I don't allow to personalize these attacks.
Hungary's parliament also changed the constitution, forbidding foreigners from settling in the country. That goes against the EU's plans to relocate tens of thousands of asylum seekers from Italy and Greece to other member states. Hungary has passed its anti-immigrant law 3 years after thousands of refugees fleeing wars in the Middle East entered the country. The vast majority of them moved on to other European states. But that didn't stop Hungary from building a fence along its southern border to prevent more from coming. More than 1 million asylum seekers reached the EU in 2015, and since then, leaders can't agree on how to handle them. The issue has impacted elections in France, Italy, Austria, and Hungary, and has put the political future of German Chancellor Angela Merkel at risk.
Wenn es uns nicht gelingt, eine gemeinsame Antwort auf die Fragen der illegalen Migration zu geben, dann werden Grundfesten der Europäischen Union in Frage geraten. Das beginnt mit der Freizügigkeit.
The UN says around 40,000 people have arrived in Europe by sea so far this year. And Italy, Greece, and Spain say the so-called Dublin regulation, where refugees must claim asylum in their first EU country of arrival, is no longer fair. Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia have also joined Hungary in refusing to take in asylum seekers under any EU plan. Several countries have suggested setting up migrant reception centers abroad to screen people before they depart for Europe, while others want the police and Coast Guard to turn away migrants at the border and at sea. Unless the EU can solve the deepening crisis on how to distribute and care for migrants and refugees who are already on the continent, and those who will arrive in the future, many are asking, is Europe not the safe haven they were hoping to find? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
We're now joined from Budapest by Zoltán Kovács. He's the spokesman for the Hungarian government. Good to have you on the program again, sir. With this new law, why is Hungary punishing people for showing compassion to migrants?
Well, that's not at all the aim or goal of the new package we have accepted. For the past 3 years, we've been very consistent in closing the legal loopholes that existed rather by now in the Hungarian and the international law, and that is organizations, so-called NGOs, camouflaging themselves as humanitarian, philanthropic organizations, are basically actively helping and inciting illegal migration. The goal is to cut and close all the loopholes that are there, and nobody has anything to fear if they follow the law.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about what the UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein had to say. He said the constant stoking of hatred by the current government for political gain has led to this latest shameful development, which is blatantly xenophobic and runs counter to European and international human rights standards and values. And he's right, isn't he? Because EU law guarantees that people have the right to asylum, something you're taking away from them. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I'm afraid he is no authority to give us any advice, especially lesson, if it's about the will of the Hungarian people and how we formulate it into our legal system. And second, we've seen that political bias and political attacks coming from people who are devoted to migration and who are basically pro-migration in their career and in their offices, which they were not entitled and not intended to do so. So what we see at the borders of the European Union, at the borders of the European continent, we all know is not a refugee crisis, it's a migration crisis. Less than 10% of those who are arriving recently are eligible for any kind of legal status. Therefore, we need to readjust our measures to stop what is happening at the borders of Europe. Hungary has been very explicit and consistent on that for the past 3 years, and this is the mandate with which our Prime Minister is going to participate at the European Council meeting today. Stop migration at the borders, defend the borders accordingly, and return everybody who is not eligible to stay in Europe.
You mentioned what you called so-called NGOs. And you said, you know, there's something else masquerading as NGOs. What's your problem with George Soros? Tell me what's your problem with him?
Well, we face here an international speculant who's earning lots of money, and that money is being spent around the globe for obvious purposes. Most of these purposes are being interpreted and, again, camouflaged as philanthropic goals and aims. But we all know that money always talks. He's got a vision about the working of the world, open society, and other philosophical concepts. And very definitely, he's got a plan. He's got a vision about the future of Europe if it's about migration. And we fully disagree. And not only Hungary, but the Visegrad 4 and more European countries have recognized that the activity of the Soros-founded and organized organization in Europe, around the globe, are going against democratically elected European governments, the will of the European people. Mr. Soros has no democratic mandate to represent and go for political decisions he was going for the past couple of years.
But do you really believe all of that, that this old rich Jew wants to flood your country with mainly Muslim migrants and somehow transform your society? It's very much a conspiracy theory, isn't it?
No, it is not, and it has nothing to do with religion. I would like to refute what you suggest here.
Although religion is central to a lot of the criticism of Soros, if you see it from among nationalists within the country, you'd accept that.
Well, I mean, you have to be very careful about formulating charges like that, because that does not suit a television station.
The government sets the tone. The government definitely sets the tone.
We have always maintained. We have nothing to do with Mr. Soros's dissent. We have nothing to do with Mr. Soros's religion, neither with the religion of migrants who are coming to the European Union. Keep in mind that Hungary has registered over 100 countries or nationalities trying to reach the European Union. So what we face and see here is a global phenomenon which should be addressed accordingly, and that is defending the European borders, reinstating the rule of law. And if someone and his organizations are going against the rule of law and reinstating legality at the borders of the European Union, we are going to name it. That's what we've been doing for the past 3 years.
Looking at the numbers, there's about 3,500 refugees in the country. And in the first quarter of 2018, according to the best available information that I have, which comes from the government, there were only 325 applications filed for asylum. So immigration is down in your country. Aren't you guys making a big deal of a non-issue here when it comes to your country specifically?
Yeah, but you have to stop here for a second. There's an obvious reason there are no more illegal migrants in the country, and that is we have built a fence. We have introduced 2 other measure systems, and that is we have adjusted our legal system, as we have mentioned earlier, and also we have deployed personnel on the ground. So we have a threefold defensive system at the borders of Hungary, therefore at the borders of the European Union. No wonder that we were able to reduce the number of illegal migrants to almost zero for the past couple of months or years. And that's the example we believe Europe should be following. There's no other way to address the consequences of illegal migration until you address the very problem itself, and that is everybody is coming to the European Union illegally across the borders of the European Union. The borders should be defended, illegal migration should be stopped.
Tell me about the constitutional amendment which says that an alien population should not settle in Hungary. Help me understand, what does that mean? What is an alien population?
As all countries around the globe and all cultures around the globe, every country and culture has its own characteristics. And we just simply refuse and refute any attempt on behalf of any bureaucracy or body that would like to change that. And that is to decide instead of us, I mean the Hungarians, the Hungarian parliament, who shall live with us in or within the boundaries of the country. This is all about, I believe the constitutional amendment gives all the means at the hands of the Hungarian government as well as the Hungarian people to defend their sovereignty, and again to go against any kind of decision on behalf, say, the Brussels bureaucracy or any international body that would try to suggest that mingling, importing or transferring larger number of people from different cultural backgrounds to given countries is going to do anything good. What we see around the globe, it is not working. The melting pot theory, integration is simply not working.
Certainly. Can you give me an example of a culture that doesn't fit into Hungary and Hungarian culture?
We see increasingly for the past couple of years or rather decades by now in Western Europe that parallel societies are developing. Islamic culture is a different culture from the Christian foundations we have in Europe. It's no superior, no inferior. It's simply different. It's following its own rules. Accordingly, it's not going to melt into what the Western European politicians believe should be some kind of non-religion or non-cultural specific culture. We don't believe in that idea, especially in face of the lessons and consequences we see in Western Europe.
Can somebody be Muslim and Hungarian at the same time?
Sure, it is possible, but there is always, again, as I suggested, there's always a major characteristic of a society. We have around, to the best of my knowledge, around 10,000 Muslims living in Hungary, Hungarian Muslims. They very much integrated into Hungarian society. But of course, numbers and ratio do matter. And this is what we would like to avoid. We see bad lessons and bad example coming from Western Europe.
Zoltán Kovács, it's been great getting some insight into the mindset of the Hungarian government. I thank you once again for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's broaden out this discussion now. Joining me now from Brussels is Catherine Woolard. She's the Secretary General of the European Council for Refugees and Exiles. Also in Brussels is Philippe Dam. He's the Advocacy Director for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch. I thank you both for joining us. Catherine, let me begin with you. You heard my interview with Zoltán Kovács. What did you think? What does that tell you about not only what Hungary thinks, but what a growing trend of countries and administrations in Europe tend to think about refugees and migrants?
I think we see Hungary as an outlier here, and I think the interview we just heard confirms that one of the real crises in Europe is not the migration crisis, it's the crisis of rule of law and the attack on the rule of law. We're expecting by the end of this year that our members and our partners in Hungary will be in prison. And so this is a situation where we call on the EU and on other member states to take action against Hungary. Enough is enough. And the offences that are now that may be punished by imprisonment include things such as giving out leaflets, giving legal advice to refugees, which are quite standard civil society activities. But any kind of opposition is frowned upon.
Right. Philippe, given that everybody's getting together and talking migration, even though Catherine might say Hungary is an outlier here, we have the Austrians and the Italians maybe closer to the Hungarians than to some of the other European countries. With that in mind, can anything positive come out of this migration summit, or are we going to see two very polarized camps locking horns?
Yes, what we are seeing is, the number of arrivals, irregular arrivals through the Mediterranean Sea has largely decreased in Europe. And despite this, it's shocking to see that a number of EU politicians, including in Hungary, continue to engineer panic on migrations and in fact fuel hatred at home and create a distorted debate on migration in Europe. What we need to say today is it's not a crisis for Europe anymore, but what it is that it's a crisis for first countries of arrival, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and it's still a crisis for the asylum seekers and migrants who remain stranded in those situations. And I hope that EU Council summit this week will lead to a real reflection about how to fix the flaws of the Dublin system, provide more solidarity, and help the countries of arrival to deal with the continued number of arrival on the ocean. That means more solidarity. That doesn't mean fueling hatred.
Catherine Woolard, one of the answers proposed is offshore processing or disembarkation centers in North Africa. Is that a reasonable solution?
It's not a feasible solution at the moment. It's legally problematic because it's not clear how people will access basic legal rights, such as the right to legal advice, the right to an appeals process from such centres. But it's also politically problematic because why should these countries host centres for Europe? 90% of the world's refugees are outside Europe, so the idea of outsourcing responsibility to other regions is not well received. And we don't see any countries willing to host such centres. So legally and politically, in terms of security, there may also be risks because such centres could become magnets for smugglers and traffickers.
Philippe Dam, we heard from Angela Merkel.
The solution as we would see it.
Certainly. Catherine, let's go to Philippe for a second. We heard from Angela Merkel that the migration challenge is make or break for the EU ahead of the summit. Is she right?
Well, for sure, this is a summit which is going to change the way in which the EU is going to look at migration. The propositions to externalize processing of asylum seekers would really put the EU in very dangerous waters. The examples of such policy that we've been seeing, in particular in Australia, has led to massive abuses, massive suffering, and this is not what we want to see reproduced by the EU. So it's really important for the EU to say no to such models of outsourcing of asylum processing, and it's important for the EU at this moment to find solution to the absurdity that it put itself by letting boats of rescued migrants drift on the ocean. We need more certainty. Probably the proposition to set up regional disembarkment centers can work if it's prioritizing disembarkment within the EU, and if it's saying no to situations outside of the EU where basic standards would not be met, where there would not be any independent verification of the situation, and where detention would be the norm. It's important for the EU to stand to these principles which have shaped asylum, and it's important for this summit to stand up to those principles. The response is not by outsourcing responsibilities and misery, it's by developing more solidarity among EU member states.
Catherine, in the build-up to the summit, we saw extraordinary drama and chaos with the rescue boat Aquarius, countries not wanting to take those migrants, eventually Spain stepping up. That entire saga, what did that tell you about where we are right now in 2018 with migration?
Clearly we see it remains an extremely tense issue. First of all, we'd say it's not the moment for macho posturing or political games when boatloads of rescued people are in the middle of the sea. I hope we're moving now to a more reasonable solution, and one of those solutions could be regional coordination mechanism within Europe with a division of responsibility for disembarkation and other member states stepping in to offer relocation when a boat of rescued people has docked. So we're seeing solutions starting to emerge. It becomes clear that it may not be possible to get solutions that all 28 member states buy into. So the coalition of the willing, setting up solidarity among smaller groups as it started to come out of the mini-summit at the weekend, may well be the way forward. It's essential that Europe remains a place that offers protection to refugees, and that includes allowing rescue ships to dock.
Okay, let's bring in from Krakow, Dominik Tarczynski now. He's a member of the Polish Parliament for the ruling Law and Justice Party. Dominik, good to inject you into this conversation. Dominik, your party and your government not big fans of immigration into Poland at this moment in time. That summit's happening. It's discussing migration. What do you want to come out of it?
Well, it's not. Well, first of all, we would like to be listened. These new solutions, new summits will not help. We've been saying that hotspots, bringing people to Europe, will not solve the problem. We have to help them where they are, where the problem, real problem is, in Syria, in Iraq. You know, even now when we are having people from Africa, Africa is over 1 billion people. How many can we receive? 100 million, 200 million, 500 millions? So that's the question to Angela Merkel, who started this madness. We have to call things as they are. This is madness. So she has to listen. She has to have a dialogue. She has to have the attitude which is ready to cooperate. At the moment, they are having another summits, another meetings, another talks, and nothing coming out of it. So listen to Poland, listen to Hungary, listen to Italy. It's not about only a Visegrad group. Listen to Chancellor of Austria and others. There is so many countries who are against it, right, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous for Europe, not only financially, but also it's about our identity.
Okay. Oh, interesting. You say it's about your identity. Catherine Woolard. So again, I almost circle back to the beginning. I ask you, what does this tell you when so many countries in Europe reflect this attitude? In many ways, it's populist. Yes, it's nationalist. But of course, it's also democratic. This is what the people want. Whether you believe they're given good messages or not, this is what the people who voted in the ruling party in Poland want. How do we solve that riddle, Catherine?
Well, let's be clear, there's a lot of myths about what the people want. In the majority of European countries, the public strongly supports offering protection to refugees, and a majority also supports immigration. We have a number of countries where we see extremists in the government, and unsurprisingly, when extremists are part of the government and controlling institutions, public opinion starts to change. In a country like Hungary, after years of propaganda on this issue, it's unfortunate but not surprising that the public starts to believe some of this. We're trying to take the debate back to reason and rationality. If we're talking about migration more widely, one of the other crises that Europe faces is the demographic crisis. It would actually be in Europe's interest to start absorbing new populations, and there are going to be severe economic problems if that doesn't happen. Instead, we see a disproportionate focus on the discourse, the myths, and the propaganda of the extremists, who in a small number of countries are part of the government. It's not a majority.
Okay.
In fact, we see in most European countries the voting share of these parties is either stable or declining.
Right. Let me get a response from Dominic. So Dominic, you're pushing myths and propaganda. If you absorbed migrants, it would be good for your economy, is one of the arguments. What's your response?
Well, first of all, I'm not nationalist. I'm not a populist. I'm not a fascist. I was called many names. I'm a proud European and proud Polish citizen. We are modern, we are open, and we don't want to have our families to be killed. The numbers are not lying. Many of the terrorist attacks were committed by refugees, not illegal immigrants, but refugees. It's just a fact, as it was in Paris. 3 out of 5 suicide bombers were refugees. So we are open to help, but for those who are going through the legal path, who are applying for asylum, not coming with the boats with the hundreds of thousands, if you would try to cross the border in Turkey, in Great Britain, whatever, you would be killed. Just because there are 100 or 200 or 300 of them, they are not allowed to cross the border. They are allowed to apply for the asylum, and we have a legal path to do so. We are helping. We are spending a lot of money. And, you know, I went to Lebanon 4 times. I spoke to these people. They don't want to come. Those who are coming, paying the smugglers to come to Germany. I met the foreign minister of Romania. I spoke to him. And he says, you know what happened when I went to the hotspot to receive a first 100? They ran away when they found out that they are not going to Germany. So Germany was looking for cheap labor, and they found some of illegal immigrants being terrorists. It's just a fact, but it's not about terrorism itself. As I mentioned, it's about our identity.
Okay, so let me go to Philippe. Philippe, is there anything that Dominic said there that you have sympathy for?
Well, I think circling back to what I said to start with, what we are hearing here is really engineering panic around migration issues and, you know, encompassing, comparing, asking for refugee and running away from war, such as many, you know, who had to come 2 years ago did, with equating that with terrorism is really not the right answer to appease the debate and ensure that we can speak about migration and asylum in an appeased way. And this is what we have to do today. There are still a number of people who arrive to Europe by sea. They have the right to apply for asylum. EU member states have the right to accept or refuse this right to asylum, but it's not by insulting people fleeing war and conflict that we are going to have a good discussion about the matter.
Okay, looking forward to seeing and hearing what comes out of the summit. Unfortunately, I've got to move on.
I did not insult anyone, if I may.
Okay, Dominic says he did not insult anybody. I don't feel he directly did.
I did not insult
everybody
anyone.
Had their say.
I'm just talking about facts.
Okay, fair enough, Dominic. Philippe, Dominic and Catherine, I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still to come on The Newsmakers, protests erupt in Iran as the economy crumbles. Could it force President Rouhani out of power? And we speak to Iraq's former national security advisor and ask what he makes of the country's unlikely new coalition. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani promised several things when he came to power, but two that stood out were nuclear talks and fixing the country's sanction-ridden economy. He had almost delivered until US President Donald Trump stepped into the picture. Now both those aims are under threat and Iranians are angry. Thousands took to the streets this week to protest against the battered economy. They're the largest demonstrations the country has seen since 2012, which ultimately led to the fall of Rouhani's predecessor. So, is Iran's president failing his people and the economy? And could these protests force him from power? Shoaib Hassan reports.
It's been a troubled few months for Iran's rulers, and these protests are the latest sign that things are not getting better. Traders marching in the streets of Tehran, protesting economic mismanagement as the local currency plummets to a new low and inflation soars. It's the latest internal challenge to President Hassan Rouhani's government, a downward spiral of events made worse by Donald Trump's decision last month.
That the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime.
It came as a blow to Iran's government led by President Rouhani, who's seen as a moderate. Their successful negotiation of the deal gave them the upper hand in an ongoing struggle for power with the country's powerful conservative Guardian Council, especially Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Earlier in the year, protesters had taken to the streets, blaming him for Iran's domestic troubles. But that's changed since Trump's reversal, with the anger now more heavily focused on Rouhani and his cabinet. They're still trying to salvage what's left of the deal with support from European leaders. But the people appear to have had enough.
I don't think we can trust the European countries because they always follow the US and only listen to what the United States says. So I don't think anything will come of this.
That anger is now turning towards the government as the economy deteriorates. It appears set to descend into further chaos as, with oil prices plummeting, arch rival Saudi Arabia has announced it will drastically increase oil production. Industry experts say it's no coincidence and could cripple Iran's economy that's almost totally dependent on oil. Is there a way out for its beleaguered government? Or will the economic crunch be a stumbling block for Rouhani and his allies? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tehran is Sadegh Zibakalam. He's a professor of Iranian studies at Tehran University. So good to have you on the program. What are these protests really about?
There are economic reasons, there are political reasons, there are social reasons behind these protests. And all of these problems are very serious. Let us, for example, look upon the economic reasons. Iranian currency, rial, has fallen dramatically during the past 4 months. And given the fact that there are many items which are imported from abroad, either in the form of the machinery, tools, equipment, chemical, raw material. You could imagine that with the increasing value of foreign currency, those people who are economically involved in producing all sorts of items, they found it very difficult. They can't sell, they can't buy because of uncertainty in the market.
Tell me what you think of the government's response so far.
Well, many people were waiting for Mr. Rouhani, the president, to address the nation, which is what he did about 48 hours ago. And unfortunately, it simply added salt to the injury, because he was addressing the nation in a manner that although people who were watching him talking, they were school children that would be excited, would become hopeful, would become cheerful. But what the president is saying, he escaped from addressing real issues, real problems, and simply keep stating that we have to be hopeful, we have to cooperate with each other, people with the government, government with the people, etc., etc. And it simply made people more frustrated and more angry from the president.
Yeah, and help me understand one more thing. There were reports of anti-US chants, there were reports of anti-Rouhani chants, anti-Khamenei chants, even anti-Palestinian chants, all sorts of different slogans and chants within multiple protests. What's going on? Is it a medley of all different types of people?
Iranians, we do not have anything against Palestinian. We do not have anything against the Lebanese, the Shiite Lebanese. We do not have anything against Syrian. We are sorry, we are sad because people in Syria are suffering. But the point is that, rightly or wrongly, there is a feeling amongst many Iranians that for the Islamic government, the Palestinian who are close to the Iranian Islamic Republic way of thinking are more important. Shiite Lebanese are more important.
Right.
Syrian people are more important than Iranian people. That's why whenever they found opportunity, they shout and they give slogans that think about us, not about Syrian people. Think about us, not the Palestinian. Think about us, not the Shiite Lebanese.
Right. Fascinating. And we're going to talk a bit more about that in a few moments. But for the moment, Sadegh Zibakalam, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's bring in two new guests now. In California, we have Abbas Milani. He's director of the Iranian Studies program at Stanford University. And in Tehran, we have Mohammad Marandi. He's a professor at Tehran University. Gentlemen, a pleasure having both of you on the program. Mohammad Marandi, let me begin with you. We heard from Sadegh Zibakalam earlier on. He felt that Hassan Rouhani is deflecting. He's rubbing salt into the wounds of the protesters by not quite tackling the issues. Is that how you see it?
No, definitely not. I don't agree at all with Mr. Ziba Kalam. First of all, with regards to Syria, according to polls carried out by the University of Maryland, the Iranians have consistently, over the past few years, supported Iranian policy on Syria and Iraq because the Iranians know that if the black flags were raised in Damascus and Baghdad, that would be a catastrophe, not for only just for the region, but for Iranians themselves. And with regards to Iran's military expenditure, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, in 2017, Iran spent less on its military than did Turkey, the Israeli regime, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. So Iran spends less money on its military than even a small country like the Emirates in this part of the world. So these are exaggerations. There is discontent in Iran. The economic problems are difficult. But I think that most Iranians recognize that the United States is engaging in warfare against the Iranian people. And I think it's a bit disingenuous for someone not to point this out.
Okay.
So while there is dissatisfaction with the problems that the administration is facing currently, and the fall of the Iranian rial, I think that people do also recognize that Trump is doing his best to, as he puts it, to strangle the Iranian people.
Okay, so Abbas Milani, we heard two very different perspectives with regards to this. We had Mr. Ziba Kalam earlier on trying to explain that some of those people on the streets are saying, hey, why is our money going towards the Syrian cause or the Palestinian cause or to the Lebanese cause with Iranians' geopolitical interests? We have Mr. Marandi saying, actually, that's just not true. Yes, there's financial discontent. And if you want to blame anyone, it's the United States strangling the Iranian economy. Where do you stand on this, Abbas Milani?
Well, I think the problems of the Iranian economy are exacerbated by Mr. Trump's politics and by the decision to reimpose sanctions. But they are only augmented. The problems of the Iranian economy is a corrupt, cronyist system that has plundered the country's water resources, social capital, financial capital. It has lost the ability to export. It has faced the country with double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment for almost 37 years. A great part of the economy is in the hands of these extra legal institutions, like those connected to Mr. Khamenei's office, connected to the IRGC, connected to the religious foundations. Often they don't pay taxes, they don't play by the rules. And that has created a perfect storm. And it is in that perfect storm, in that corrupt, incompetent regime and economy filled with despair, that Mr. Trump is trying to bring about more pressure with the idea, I think, eventually of bringing about a regime change. I'm very sorry for the Iranian people.
Mohammed Maradi, it's a corrupt cronyist system. The rot comes from within, not from without. What do you think?
Well, we've been hearing that sort of thing from people like your guests in the United States for the last 4 decades. For the last 4 decades, it has been a corrupt regime, as they like to call it, collapsing. The irony, of course, is that they always put forward this paradox, and that Iran is utterly corrupt, it's collapsing, it's unpopular. Of course, the turnout for elections in Iran are phenomenal. But on the other hand, it's a growing menace, it's a threat to the world. You can't have your cake and eat it as well. Iran is not, the sanctions against Iran that Trump is imposing are intense and severe and quite barbaric, but they're not new. Obama was pursuing crippling sanctions for years. And even after Iran signed the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, the United States continued to violate the agreement. And during the 3 years before Trump exited the agreement, the Iranians were never able to access the international banking system. And this issue about cronyism and so on and so forth, you can say the same thing about the oligarchy that now exists in the United States and the Occupy Wall Street movement that we had years ago and the imbalances in the United States, the collapse of the middle class. The Iranian economy is facing problems at home. A large part of it is because of sanctions, and a large part of it is because of the problems that all countries face. But Iran has a major disadvantage, and it has the most powerful country in the world attacking it. And instead of attacking Iran, your guest should be criticizing the United States.
Abbas Milani?
Well, first of all, I don't need lessons from Mr. Marandi about who I should criticize. I have criticized the Trump administration. If he had read what I have written,
I think you
he would
do.
know that I do criticize it, and I would be a little more polite and wait for the time I finish before you enter the discussion. The problems of Iran are the problems of the Iranian regime. They have been added to these problems because of the sanctions. But let's take the issue of the nuclear deal. When Rouhani signed the nuclear deal, Mr. Khamenei, as a despotic leader, decided unilaterally that he was not going to allow normalized relations with the United States. He declared categorically that he was not going to allow direct negotiations between Rouhani and Obama. And they waited and they waited. They wasted 2.5, almost 2 years during the Obama administration till they got to Trump. And part of their inability to cash in on the results of the nuclear deal was precisely the policies that the regime pursued. The Iranian diaspora, for example, is very, very capable of helping Iran solve some of its economic problems. The judiciary that is corrupt to the core and is a direct tool of Mr. Khamenei and parts of the IRGC has made every effort to make it impossible for the diaspora to go back to Iran and help contribute solve this problem. What happened to someone who went from England, tried to solve the water problems in Iran is just one example. The number of people who are now arrested.
Okay, let's get a response. Okay, Professor Marandi.
I think it's quite insulting for your guest to speak of all these Iranian academics and intellectuals and educated people at top-notch universities in Iran and in different institutions who are quite capable of solving the country's problem. They don't need people who are necessarily fluent in English or who are in the United States to tell them how to run the country. They're quite competent and smart themselves. If the United States and countries like the United States were not trying to destroy Iran and to destroy the Iranian economy, Obama called it crippling sanctions. What did that mean? It meant to cripple the Iranian people. That is barbaric. Instead of giving this caricature of Iranian life and society, which is, by the way, a disservice to the Iranian people, because what people in the United States who are actually, I don't know about your guest, your current guest, but about many of these people who are critical of the United States, by constantly producing this caricature of Iran, an evil regime that is completely unpopular, they simply encourage Trump to put more pressure, because people like Trump mistakenly think that they can, through pressure, bring down the Islamic Republic. But let me give you just one example that would dismantle the notion that the gentleman put forward. And that is that after the nuclear agreement, which was accepted by the Islamic Republic, including the leader, while the deal was being negotiated, Ayatollah Khamenei said in a public speech that if the United States were to implement the nuclear agreement faithfully and honorably, then we could start negotiating on other issues. But your guests in the United States and others, they erase this reality from the equation.
Fair point, fair point.
From day one, Obama began violating the agreement.
And Trump pulled out.
He passed new sanctions. He passed the Iran Sanctions Act, limit the visa restriction laws. They were not faithful to the agreement.
Okay, and then Trump pulled out. Abbas Milani, people are still protesting. traders, merchants, shopkeepers and others, young people, old people. What needs to happen now to satisfy the Iranian people, to get them back to work and to grow the economy?
I think what needs to happen, first of all, I must say that I did not say that there aren't people in Iran who could solve Iran's problems. They might not include Mr. Marandi, but there are many, many top scholars, top scientists who are trying to work.
You are indeed the polite one, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I talk in the same spirit as you do. But I never have said that Iran is not capable of solving these problems. Iran is a very rich country. Iran has one of the richest intellectual capitals of any country in the Middle East. But the Iranian, now 10% of Iran's population almost live outside. And they have a share in determining the future of Iran. That's the only thing that I was suggesting. And I think the only thing that is going to solve the economic, social, cultural, political crisis that the Iranian society, Iran as a culture, Iran as a country faces, the only solution to it is a kind of a national reconciliation, a kind of national recognition that everyone must contribute, and the recognition that the current leadership has brought the country to the verge of collapse.
Okay, well, bring in the diaspora, says Abbas Milani. I wish we could continue. We cannot because I have to move on. But I found that very absorbing.
I would like to just give one,
okay,
add
go
one
very
point.
quickly. 20 seconds, please, sir. Very quickly.
First of all, 10% of the Iranian population is not outside the country. Like the other information, it's quite warped. Look at the U.S. Census, and you'll find out that that's a huge exaggeration. But there are many problems in Iran. But at the end of the day, this narrative has been going on, this discourse has been going on for 4 decades. And the international community is being misled by this. And this only encourages the likes of Trump. Iran is one of the few countries in this region that has elections, and our president is elected by the people. And so are other arms of the state, either directly or indirectly. And that is something that people should appreciate.
Okay. And I appreciate you both taking the time to talk to us on the Newsmakers, Abbas Milani and Mohammed Marandi. Thanks again. This week marks 4 years since Daesh declared its so-called caliphate in Mosul. Now it's been defeated and Iraq is forming a new government. But Haider al-Abadi, the man at Iraq's helm during the terror group's demise, will no longer be calling the shots. Instead, the new power broker is Muqtada Sadr, the Shia cleric who fought American forces after the fall of Saddam Hussein. But his party can't run Iraq on its own, and despite dramatic differences, the Sadrists have formed a coalition with Iran-backed Hadi al-Amri and outgoing Prime Minister Abadi. So, will this coalition work? Let's ask the country's former National Security Advisor, Mowaffak al Rubaie. He joins us from Baghdad. Sir, pleasure talking to you again. Muqtada Sadr driving the political field in Iraq right now. How do you feel about that?
I don't think there is any particular parliamentary blocs which is going to form the government. I wish this is the best option, probably, if we have a majority government whereby it crosses the sectarian and ethnic line and form a government of all sects and all ethnicity and lead the country with the rest are like an opposition.
Right.
But actually what is going to happen is the Shia are going to get together 5 major players of the Shia, and they're going to choose the new prime minister for the next government. Now, after they chose the prime minister and agreed on it, they will approach the Kurds, and especially the KDP and the PUK, to choose the president of the Republic of Iraq.
Right.
And they then approach the Sunni community to choose the Speaker of the Parliament. So unfortunately, it's going to be more of the same.
When you say more of the same has been chaos for a long, long time, has been very sectarian in nature. Is it going to be sectarian in nature?
No, I don't think this is going to be sectarian. I don't think this is going to be a chaos, as you said. I believe this is like a de facto whereby they will choose a prime minister as a Shia and the speaker of the parliament as a Sunni Arab, and the president of the republic is going to be a Kurd. This is like it's not written in the constitution. It's not as something like the norm of the politics of Iraq since 2003 invasion.
Right, and it's a very complicated place, and I'm thankful you mentioned the 2003 invasion, because it's been 15 years on since the 2003 US-led invasion, 9 years since security was handed over to the Iraqis from the US forces. But going to Saddam Hussein, the man who was at the center of everything when the US invaded, I want to kind of rewind a little bit and ask you if everything was worth it. Because as far as I understand, you pulled the lever when Saddam Hussein was hanged, and you have the rope in your own home. With all the trouble that Iraq has been through, with Daesh, with sectarianism, with all the death and destruction and bloodshed, when you look back to that day, was it still worth it?
To be absolutely honest with you, it is well worth it, because freedom doesn't have a value. You cannot say, I will value the freedom. You cannot trade freedom with something else. Dictatorship and democracy, with all its ills, with all its problems, with all its dilemma and major ills, if you like, of democracy, but it's much better, because at least you find your sense of belonging to this country, your sovereignty, your independence. You lead your country. You choose the prime minister, the president, and the speaker of the parliament. You choose your own government. Whether that choice is wrong or right, that's up to the voters, up to the Iraqi people. But they have the choice. At least you have a choice. There you don't have a choice.
Mowaffak al Rubaie, it's been a pleasure talking to you here on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us once again. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.